Hello, I am Tanya Duffy. I am the Barnes County State's Attorney, and today I'm going to give you some tips, suggestions, and what I feel are best practices for prosecuting child abuse cases. Prosecutors need to be familiar with the structure that the interviewer is trained on, beginning with the layout of the room, the fact that other people are observing this interview from a separate location, and the style of questions that are asked. Interviewers are specially trained individuals, and they repeat this process during each interview. Get to know your forensic interviewer. They are certainly able to teach you a lot of things. Ask them about rapport building and ask them why they explain the rules of the room. Ask them why they explain the room in itself and why they ask questions a certain way. In order to understand suggestibility, it's important to understand what suggestibility is. Suggestibility is when an interviewer communicates to a child, either verbally or non-verbally, in order to get them to say something. How do prosecutors combat the claims of suggestibility in forensic interviewers? Well, it begins with understanding the research behind memory and suggestibility. There's a large amount of resources online that provide the research behind memory issues and suggestibility within forensic interviews. Pay attention to how many times the child corrects the interviewer during the interview. If the child corrects the interviewer at all, it shows a couple of things. First, it shows that the child is paying attention to the details that the interviewer is taking in. If the child corrects them on anything, really, the child is demonstrating that their answers are not suggested by the interviewer because the child is the one who is correcting the interviewer. If there was a deviation from the typical protocol that interviewers engage in, it's important to understand why. These can happen for multiple reasons. For example, there could be more than one person who abused the child, and that disclosure comes later. There can be a certain amount of information that wasn't provided at the initial interview, and a subsequent interview can be scheduled. It can also be that the child was uncomfortable at the first interview and they didn't disclose anything, but at a later time the child decides that they're ready to come forward and talk. Deviation from the typical protocol can happen for multiple reasons, and it's important to understand why. If a child discloses additional abuse at a later time, there would be an additional interview scheduled. This can happen if the child only discloses a certain amount of abuse at the first interview and then later discloses to somebody that there was more abuse than what they had initially said. If that was to happen, then the child would be scheduled for an additional interview. Another thing to keep in mind when challenging claims of suggestibility is the type of questions that the interviewer uses as a whole. Typically, interviewers use questions that are non-suggestive and non-leading. This needs to be emphasized in the prosecutor's direct examination of that interviewer as well as their redirect. It can be suggested that the use of Play-Doh within the interview is suggestive in itself. It's important for the interviewer to be able to explain that the use of Play-Doh in itself is not suggestive. In fact, it's a coping mechanism for the child to be able to talk about difficult things. It's important for the interviewer to be able to explain anatomical drawings as well. Interviewers are able to explain within their testimony that anatomical drawings in themselves are not suggestive. In fact, they are only used for clarification purposes. Finally, it's important for interviewers to explain that they do not have any personal bias, as they do not know any of the parties that are involved within the case.